Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining the Behind Company Lines podcast. Today we have Rob Petrozzo, co-founder of Rally, the pioneer alternative investing platform for blue chip and digital collectibles, including classic cars, sports memorabilia, Birkin Bags, watches, and NFTs, totaling over 400 assets in 19 plus different categories. Rob, I'm so excited to chat with you and not only learn about your founder journey and share that experience, but also what Rally's doing and what kind of the overall, as the NFT and crypto market kind of change, and they obviously the volatility and all that, but they've really kind of created a different asset class that people are now becoming a little bit more wise to and starting to invest and pay a lot of attention. And throughout this transition, I'm curious to what the current state is and where things are going. But before we get into Rally, what were you doing before you started the company?
Julian, what's up, man? Thank you for having me, dude. I appreciate it. That was a very robust intro, too. You just touched on everything that we've been doing for the last 6 years in a quick 10 seconds. I appreciate it.
It's a sound.
Yeah, that's a good soundbite to start. I'm going to steal that. But I mean, long story short, for the length of my career, for what's going on, starting when I was 17 years old, so going on more than 20 years at this point, is really been based around design, around products. And I think that over the evolution of tech and where digital started to really take hold, I think the last couple of years with NFTs are a great example. Physical and tangible products were always the most interesting thing to me. And it was something that I always wanted to sort of design, either sneakers or cars or whatever was the thing that I was paying attention to as a kid. It becomes where you want to put your time and your attention. And thinking about going into automotive design or becoming an architect. When I was younger, that was kind of what I was thinking the whole time. And then what happened is eventually I wound up finding a little bit of a niche in fine art and then in graphic design that turned into digital design and working with a bunch of startups. But really I was just trying to sort of get my foot in the door, getting out of school. That wound up being in music. So I was working at a bunch of record labels at one point, doing packaging and CDs and things that kids now have no idea what they actually are. Back then it was all about physical packaging. That led into a bunch of web design, and you learn a little bit of code. And I think everybody at a certain point in the mid 2000s had a pirated copy of Photoshop and was trying to sort of using Dreamweaver and these basic coding tools to make websites. Inevitably that turned into being in New York, where it became this tech startup really quickly and this sort of hub for tech startups in 2008, 2009. It led me to a bunch of great founders who were sort of young and ambitious. And I saw what they were doing without having to work for a big company or without having to they were making their own rules to a certain degree in New York. And that was super interesting to me. So I ended up at a bunch of startups in the publishing space and in the hardware space and in computer vision in the early days of it in the 2010s, 2013s. And now led to Rally, myself, my co-founders, Max and Chris. We've known each other for a long time. We've always wanted to work together on something. So this was a place that we kind of put our passions and things that we cared about and then make it available to everybody and solve that problem that we had and then really amplify it and hopefully solve it for millions of people at some point in the near future.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I was looking at your background designing. You obviously work with not only a lot of artists, but you've had a lot of companies and labels and things like that. Describe kind of the mesh between technology and entertainment in particular. I think it kind of bleeds into what's so fascinating about the NFT space being such a unique experience to either have one or have one that's similar to somebody else's. But describe the mesh between kind of entertainment and that kind of focus with design. And when did it start to become fairly regular for people within these different industries to start utilizing web design and these online kind of marketplaces to really promote themselves and gain traction and start gaining an audience? Obviously, if we take it back, Soulja Boy was one of the first ones to really have an online
first to do everything. If you look first to do everything.
Everything. Yeah. He was doing it all. But tell me this, then describe to me that kind of the mesh of the transition between technology and entertainment and when people really started taking marketing and branding seriously.
Yeah, I mean, listen, they were pioneers who've been doing this forever. And there are certain artists who really want to own, and I'm thinking about this in terms of music, but it translates to fine art and to a lot of different design and a lot of different creative, sort of the fabric of creativity, especially in New York, where it's just you gotta make it here. And if you make it here, you make it anywhere thing. But I think what happened, when I got out of school, it was the mid 2000s. And my first real, the first time I got a paycheck from a company was working for Kayne West label at the time, which was called Good Music, and it still kind of exists. But this was the first iteration where artists were starting to take their own image and what they did really seriously and didn't want to put it in the hands of a label or of some sort of corporate machine to dictate what they look like and kind of what how fans interacted with them. And that was when distribution deals became a little bit bigger than they were in the previous iteration of music industry, especially. And when it came to rap and it came to music, where it was really about culture and fashion, all these things merged together. It wasn't just a packaged up pop or act. I think what I saw firsthand was that the artists that really understood how to take a budget and make it work for them were the ones that were succeeding. And those are the ones that said, like, I'm not going to let some label control my image or let some boardroom decide how people interact with me and what my fans see. And that was a situation that in 2005, we got a budget from Sony, and we had like a small office on like the 17th floor of the Sony building, which is this epic spot on Madison Avenue where every single like big artist was coming out of at the time. And we had like this little tuck away spot where everything there was treated like a startup. And it was a relatively small budget compared to today's budgets, but it meant that Kanye and his team were in charge of everything from the logos, the touring packages, to the merch, to the album release, to the marketing rollout. They were kind of using their own money to do it and do like the music videos that went with it. And if it was successful, the payoff was way bigger. If it wasn't, it was something where it was a little bit tough and you had to go back to basics a little bit. And Kanye had a bunch of hits out of the gate. So it was like John Legend, and then Big Sean came soon after, and names that you know today. But at the time, they were like just started sort of getting like their footing, and it required a lot of interaction with fans. It required like your own little website, not just the MySpace page, which again, I'm dating myself to explain this. And it meant that if you're doing a tour, you got to do merch that's really unique and not just throw your name on a t-shirt. And it meant that if you were doing an album rollout, there was probably a digital component to it because that was starting to be big and MP3s were becoming a thing. So all that together was like the really, in my mind, when independence became cool. Because before that in music, you had to have the big machine behind you, had the big label. If you were an independent artist, that meant like you couldn't get a big label to care about you. Now everybody wants independence. And I think that what we're seeing now is that the hands, it's not just about creators, it's creators with something. It's someone who can build an audience that they can then monetize. And the most successful creators now are not people with huge Instagram followings anymore. It's somebody who doesn't need a company to dictate what they do. So when I look at like the things that the people around us are doing, or the people that we recognize in the space now, where it's like a Logan Paul with Prime, or some of the other influencers who were influencers are now creators that can pick and choose where their brand goes. They don't have to wait for a giant cable company or like a pharmaceutical company to give them a check to get paid. They can spin up their own products and their own things, put their own money into it, and then have a huge group of supporters behind them. I think like Mr. Beast is a perfect example of that. If anybody would have said Mr. Beast is going to sell cheeseburgers at some point like 3 years ago, you just said, I don't know who that is or what are you talking about? But it made complete sense. And that's why there's a line out the door now, because it's so in tune with his brand. He's so directly connected to his audience. I think with every startup, and that was kind of like the music days were really the first entry of it for me. But now when it comes to a startup and what we do here at Rally, the ability to connect with community directly, to take their cues and spin up new product really quickly and really access like their emotions and things they care about without having to wait for somebody else to either approve a budget or to go do a huge marketing campaign or do a huge focus group. Like we have a really good feel for what our audience wants. And I think I've been lucky to be around a lot of people, individuals and small businesses who took that same approach of put a lot of blood, sweat and tears into it, knowing that the payoff will be way bigger if we get this right. And we're not going to wait for somebody else to dictate what direction we go in.
Yeah. And describe what that means to the longevity of whether it's a brand or an art. Well, I would say artist is a brand. It's like its own entity, right? But describe the longevity it means for the brand and honestly how that kind of translates to other, it's almost like that brand and those customer base kind of funnel into other projects. And even if those projects aren't successful, it's the experience of it that was extremely unique. Describe what that means for people coming up, for people who are working on just maintaining that brand, that image, and the longevity and the different projects that they can now start doing with the audience that they've gained and what that audience means in terms of a monetary sense.
Yeah, I mean, it really becomes your moat. It's because there's viewers and followers, and then there's like real community and audience. I think everybody kind of gets that confused. But if you're building for fans first and not for the motivations of the business behind it, and not for the motivation of the giant business that funded it or whatever it is, your relationship gets way different. And I think that from a longevity standpoint, if you do right by your earliest customers, those first 1,000 people, they're going to be with you and they're going to become your word of mouth. If it's just a commercial and it's like a deal, or you started with some sort of promo to get people involved, or you're making all your money on like a YouTube as a creator and you have no other means of sort of taking your audience with you, you don't own that audience. You don't own that customer. You don't own the relationship is really the biggest part. So for me, from a longevity standpoint, like I still maintain a lot of conversations, whether it's over text or DM, with like our earliest customers. And we're talking about 5-6 years now. And these are people who still have real meaningful feedback about our platform. And we don't always, I guess at this point, I would say we can't always act immediately. And a lot of what we do is regulated by the SEC. And obviously we work inside this financial construct that's a little bit different than just spinning up a t-shirt. But at the same time, there's so many brands around us that I've seen do it from day one correctly with their fan base and turn their fans into equity owners. Whether that's like actual equity, like we do, which we give out, we're selling equity individual assets, or it's like the equity where you're a part of this and we're taking what you do and we're putting it to work and we're making sure that you're happy with the outcome because you're building for your fans first. If you're building for anything other than your fans, or you're trying to guess what some giant new audience is going to like, you're going to lose that. You're going to lose that trust. So from a longevity standpoint, if you're doing that from day one and you always go back to that, you're going to withstand every single trend. There's always going to be highs and lows. You don't have to worry about getting like deplatformed by some other platform that turns off your money system or turns off the conversation, or if TikTok goes out of business. So doing that where you can bring your fans with you, if you're building for them, you're doing right by them early, you stay in the conversation and maintain contact and build on the things that make sense that they're making the suggestions for, you're not going to lose those people. They're going to find you no matter where you end up. I think we've seen a lot of, now it's so much more interesting for an 18-year-old who has talent, has creativity, has some sort of product to sell that people want, to connect directly with the people that want to make that purchase and want to liberate dollars towards that mission. It's stupid in my mind to come out now and say, I got to wait for somebody else to do it for me. You're not going to have real fans. You're not going to have a real business. So that's what we've always tried to do, is build fan first and build from the ground up like that.
Yeah. And it's also fascinating that the paradigm has really shifted for fans to really acknowledge success and all the accolades. And really I feel like fans, and myself included, love the journey, the progress and the steps, the milestones, the pain, the heartache. We almost like take that experience and put into our own. But speaking about experience and speaking about your experience in particular, so you've been working with artists, you're designing a lot of different things for different campaigns and all this branding. What particularly caught your eye about the blockchain space and NFTs in particular as another way to, whether actually I'll let you answer that question. What caught your eye about NFTs, and when in particular did you see the value of it growing, and what got you excited about building around it?
I mean, first and foremost, everything sort of crypto got to a point, I think, that it became so ubiquitous that everyone was waiting on the next thing. And once that post Thanksgiving 2017 happened, where everybody was talking about it in the same conversation, you had that meteoric spike and everything kind of dipped after that. We had this second mini bull run that started a couple of years ago and ran through COVID. And now we're back to like a nice, meaningful place where it's not as volatile as it once was, I'll say, but it's still something that I think crypto cemented itself as a viable place. Whether it's risky or not, it's got credibility at this point, which it didn't early on. And once that happened, I think everybody, myself included, was waiting to see like what gets built on top of this next, what gets built on top of the blockchain next, that becomes something that is the next moment, is the next thing that my mom is texting me about and asking me. And NFTs became that really quickly, I think. So what really drew me, was as a creator, as a designer, as somebody who has seen massive corporations steal my work for free and put it out somewhere, and it becomes a giant thing. You don't get a single check for it ever. The idea of living outside the gallery construct or living outside that design construct for somebody who's got talent but needs audience was really interesting to me. But then the second piece of it, that NFTs really opened the door for me. We at Rally work in this regulated environment where we have offering circulars that get submitted to the SEC. We have 1,000 lawyers who are charging us nonstop to go through the process. We have a very specific stack that we have to build on top of, which is really expensive to maintain. The ability to spin something up really quickly and do it for relatively cheap and let people really interact with that. And whether it's from a speculative standpoint or it's a utility, they stick with it if it's something that you can keep building on top of, was really interesting. So you have, with NFTs and with any of the projects that you've seen come out, independent of the ones that are just cash grabs or the ones that don't offer any utility, that are just made for art and for speculation purposes, the blockchain and the ability to spin up projects quickly at a very low cost allows for small teams that are distributed all over the world that don't have VCs and huge budgets to make something very impactful very quickly, and to do that super transparently and distribute it really quickly. So that to me was automatic as something that we should start thinking about and building on the side of what we do, just to sort of test what the limits would be. And if it came to putting out a project, which we wound up doing, that we could tie back to physical, then it's like killing two birds with one stone a little bit. So that's like the speed to market, the ability to spin it up without a ton of money or a ton of resources, and doing something new that gets everybody excited. Once all those things converged and I had people in my family texting me, asking me about what Bored Apes were, that was just an aha moment where it was pretty obvious we had to start paying attention to it more seriously.
Yeah. And it's so fascinating. And I would love for you to understand the process of the physical turning minted into an NFT project, and what that means, because the ecosystem around that. I have a few questions to follow up in terms of how the mechanics work essentially, but describe the process, if you will, of minting something that's physical, they're collectible, and then putting it on your network to then get other people interested or buy part ownership into. Describe that process, describe what Rally does in particular, and just illuminate our audience a little bit.
Yeah. So we have like two big buckets of things that we do. One is the actual offering. So these aren't NFTs. They're real physical assets. We turn them into LLCs, into actual companies, basically. Each individual asset, whether it's a dinosaur fossil or it's a Michael Jordan rookie card, or even an NFT. What it is we'll take like a Bored Ape, let's say, and we'll use that as the example. We'll acquire it. We'll put it into an LLC. We'll get that LLC sort of a very specific price. We'll break it into X amount of shares. We'll submit that to the SEC. They approve that offering as like investing in a company, the same way you might invest in a startup. We open that on Rally inside the app. Every Friday or so, we run IPOs, which are very similar to regular IPOs that you see in a standard market, in a standard equities market. A bunch of people invest in it. And then 3 months later, it trades on our platform. So over the course of that time, people might make offers to buy it. And that goes to a vote that our investors say we want to sell the whole thing. They might start trading it on our secondary market and sell their shares without having to sell the whole asset. And then along the way, like we could do cool stuff like when there's an airdrop, which has happened often for a lot of these individual NFTs that are on Rally, that becomes a dividend check for investors. So really it's about for us, it's like formalizing a process that's been around forever. Like the stock markets existed forever.
Yeah.
NFTs are relatively new and crypto is relatively new in the grand scheme of things. People kind of understand all these things. They also understand collectibles, the things that are valuable that they care about.
Sure.
To do it with fiat currency on Rally has become a really interesting sort of wrinkle for a lot of people, especially in the NFT market, where everybody, even experts you see it all the time on Twitter, they'll get their wallet stolen, or there's a really onerous process to get through a minting. So to do it where it has all the dynamics that even the experts in the NFT space expect, but it's done in a regulated way where these are real securities that are qualified by the SEC. And it's something where like there's a custodian that lives in between, which is us. Like the idea of having a completely non-custodial platform means that you're at the mercy of a MetaMask. If you lose all your money or lose your assets, you're kind of out of luck. We do it where there is that customer service layer, but to us, we don't look at that as a negative. Like that's a positive for us. You have so many people that want to make their first investment, whether it's in an NFT or a collectible, but they don't want to have to go through a process of turning fiat into crypto, put crypto into a MetaMask, and a MetaMask connect that to a site that might look a little suspect and hope that they get something out of it. We try to take all of that and shrink it down to a really binary, easy to understand outcome. And it's worked really well for us over the course of the last few years.
And it's so fascinating thinking about just the wave of fractional ownership into physical objects. Like, and we saw it with fine art, and then now it's moved into collectibles. And what does that mean for sharing that audience experience, or even getting, I feel like collectibles at some point kind of lived and died at a shop. But now we've created this online marketplace. At first it was eBay, but there was a lot of risk in purchasing something and it not being authentic. How has this ability to keep track of the authenticity of a collectible, share that experience, broadcast it to a greater audience, actually increase the value of a lot of things that we felt were just going to kind of waved away into an attic or a closet? How does that kind of revitalize and rejuvenate these kind of physical assets?
That's a great question. I think it's a big part of making sure that not just the past, the way that sort of things went to auction, went to private collections or got sold at shops, like you said, like at vintage shops or at antique stores, but that things that are relevant live forever. And I think that that's how when we source an asset, and we have, like you said, it's over 400 assets and it's millions of dollars worth of individual collectibles. And it's everything from 60 million year old dinosaurs to all cars and comic books and NFTs, but it's also things that I think a lot of people didn't know existed. So we have one of the 20 July 1776 versions of the Declaration of Independence. So this really important document that I think a lot of people thought there's only one, the one that's signed that has John Hancock's big signature on it, which is sitting in the rotunda in DC. There's 20 other versions, give or take, in private collections right now. Most of them have been in single families for the better part of more than 200 years. One of those is on Rally. It went public around $2 million. It traded up to around $3.7, $3.8 million. It's got a couple of buyout offers from wealthy individuals who want to put it in private collections. But I think a lot of what we did with that document was unearth it and tell the story around it and explain that there was more than one, and explain that historical documents are very much treated as a commodity in certain situations, but they're meaningful now. And we believe, and I think a lot of the fandom around it, a lot of our users believe it will be relevant for future generations, not just the nearest. So I think a lot of taking these assets and fractionalizing them and putting them on platforms like Rally and making sure they're displayed appropriately and they go into our museum space here in New York and we make sure we're doing social around them, we're doing interviews around it, is making sure that the relevance that was always kind of there under the radar gets distributed a little more widely. And now you have real fandom that's being created out of it. So you don't have to be a fan of the Declaration of Independence to be a fan of U.S. history or to be a buff on U.S. history and do the research. And now you can have a real piece of this insane story that's lasted more than 300 years. And you have a piece of one of the founding documents that go with it. Is really, really interesting, even for a younger demographic, just as much as it is for that older history buff who's been around forever. So it's definitely a big part of what we do, is making sure that the relevance, we do what we can to make sure that the value is clear and explain the comps and the detail around the numbers that go with it. But also, if something's relevant now, we believe it to be relevant in the future. A lot of what we do is try and tell that story as appropriately as possible.
Yeah. And what does that mean? Just like this whole, in terms of how this, so previously we saw the value of a lot of these objects only come to light when it goes to auction, right? And there's almost this updated value, and the time span of that could be a year, it could be 2 to 3 years, 10 years, 200 years, whoever knows. What does that mean in terms of the speed at which these change value at, being that they're publicly traded on the website? And what does that mean in terms of how people overvalue or undervalue object that we commonly didn't see for time that had passed? What does that mean to the value? And does the overall kind of increase it, decrease it? Whatever you kind of see in a common thread.
I think right now we're at a point that a lot of markets are trying to find themselves, and this is no different. I think that we've always believed, and I've always believed, that tons of individuals who really care about an item, care about a collectible, care about an asset, are going to be much better at valuing that asset over time than just one rich person buying it from another rich person at auction and doing that kind of secretly, or doing it where it just changes hands between the two of them and no one ever knows. I think that we've always sort of over-indexed these titans and these pillars of society and the 2 or 3 giant funds that have all of these individual assets, have all the alternative assets and all the real estate. We've always just believed that they're the right people to price these assets. That might have been true at a certain point when the pool was much smaller, but now liquidity is such a big part of what we do. And I believe that that's going to be what changed the dynamic of these alternative assets and makes it real. More liquidity and more people that care is what helps find that real price and what finds that true sort of speed to market and finds that true context for so many of these. Equities and stocks, they're super liquid and they're in the mainstream. They're in the zeitgeist forever. I think crypto over the last 2 or 3 years, without question, has now moved its way in where that's mainstream. It's at the point that pension funds pay attention to it, whether they're in it or not. I think collectibles are going to be there at a certain point. Alternative assets like these are going to be there at a certain point. It requires thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of people who really care about it to be able to sort of dictate where the price goes. Right now, it's going to be a little bit wacky in the near term while it tries to find its footing. But long term, I trust thousands of people and an average or a median of those thousands of people than one person who's sitting in like a Mr. Burns closet desk somewhere saying, I'm going to go buy this. I'm buying this dinosaur right now. I will be the one that sets the price. Like, I don't want to believe that. Nobody wants to believe that in the future.
Right.
So I'm excited to see what happens when the masses really understand what this is in the near future.
Yeah. And one thing I have a question about in terms of the mechanics and the fractional ownership piece is what happens, is there ever the case where somebody has a majority of ownership, and what happens if they were to try to say, act upon that in terms of actually, if they have a majority ownership, say over 50%, try to have that physical object. And then secondly, how do you decide which ones you will sell off? When you go and do your research, obtain an asset, you talk to investors, somebody gives you an offer, what makes you decide what's relevant to sell and what's relevant to keep?
Yeah, I mean, the long and short of it is that everything on Rally is always for sale. We basically have a museum inside the app and you can scroll through it, and you might like 80s era Ferraris and we have some of that for you. You might go into Muhammad Ali collectibles and didn't know they existed. Now you want those. All of those, every single asset has a button on the bottom of it that says, do you want to buy the whole asset? It says, let's talk. And that opens up a quick form that talks to us. It explains a little bit about what the last price was and how the process works. And if you want to submit a buyout offer, you could put all your information in. It goes to our team. If it's within fair market value, our team qualifies that investor or that buyer as having the money available. It goes into escrow and we run a quick 48-hour vote with all the investors. If 51% of them say yes, they like the outcome, then it goes to our third-party advisory board and we'll complete the sale. Everyone gets paid off. But there are situations, and it's happened a ton. We've had 65 or so buyout offers for individual assets on the platform, of which 43 or 44, I believe, have exited. What we see is that the investors who come into these assets, people that spend $100, $200, but thousands of them together are the ones that are investing in these assets and buying at the IPO and trading those assets. They have strong ties to so many of these assets, and they have their own thesis around the value, and they have their own thesis around investing, whether it's a short-term or a long-term investment. If you have a bunch of people in an asset that are there as long-term investors, and you have somebody who submits a buyout offer, and if they own shares, they're part of the vote too. But if they don't have 50 or 60% of it at that point, then, they're beholden to what all the investors want to do. We want to democratize this where it's for everybody, and that decision-making is for everybody. So we'll see a lot of times a vote goes to investors. They'll say no to the price or to the asset, something that they want to keep. They feel like it's theirs and they're not going to be able to replace it in the future. They have a long-term investing thesis. They'll all vote it down and the asset will stay on the platform. Then that particular collector who wanted to buy it will start sort of developing a much bigger position so that they can potentially get it in the future. But like any other market, that means you have to bid it up and you have to go get the shares. And you see those we publish the entire order book inside the app and on the website. So you can kind of see, you can't see names and who people are.
Sure.
But when someone's trying to accumulate a position, you can kind of see it. And I think our investors have gotten really savvy in that when they see that, they're going to raise their asks up a little bit too. And they're going to sort of have that little mini fight. You see it starts to develop on the platform. It's one of the really interesting dynamics is that if someone tries to do a buyout and can't get it, they're going to try for a hostile takeover sometimes. They're going to try and get every share on that open market. And if that happens, that's just how markets work. I think that we've really relied on our investors and the savviness of these investors who've really developed strong positions in certain assets to be the dictators of whether or not, dictate's the wrong word, but be the arbiters of whether or not those offers are meaningful enough to get them out of it and get it into private hands. That's a big part of what we do is we allow people to kind of see around those turns and say, you know what, people aren't really paying attention to this Pokemon card right now, but I've been paying attention to this my entire life. I know where this is headed right now. I'm gonna stake my claim on this right now, knowing that in 2 or 3 years, the rest of the world's gonna start to get a hint of what I've known this whole time. And when that pays off, it happens in a real way where somebody comes in and make that buyout offer at a significant premium to the IPO, and that intuition is proven right. And that's really one of the reasons that we exist.
Yeah. So fascinating. Tell us a little bit more about the traction. You said we described it. You have 400 plus assets, 19 plus different categories. What's not only been excited about what you've done up to this point, but what you're really kind of looking forward to into this next year and the next kind of evolution of the product.
Yeah, I think that again, like we said early on, we always try and build to our fans. So hundreds of thousands of users at this point. We're going to get to 1 million users really soon. And we're going to do that in a way where it's really been word of mouth. So a lot of what we've done at this point, we don't have a true marketing function at the company like that. Everything has really been word of mouth. And we've always relied on these individual collectibles and these assets as the true celebrities kind of. We don't have like celebrity endorsements, people running around saying like, go buy things on Rally because it's a regulated marketplace. So what we do is we let the assets kind of speak for themselves. So getting into new categories to get people excited, getting into intangible assets, whether it's NFTs or real estate or some of the things that we've started to do now, get into cash flow producing assets, which instead of just having a trade on our secondary market, you have the opportunity to get some regular kind of dividends and cash flow coming from the asset. All that's on the roadmap right now. But really, we want to go in the direction of the public. Democratizing alternative assets is not about just doing it in 1 or 2 or 19 or 25 or 100 categories. It's about finding those things that people don't even realize right now are the assets that we'll be talking about in the future. So we always pay attention to the conversation too. We know that liquidity in our secondary market and in these assets is going to be what drives this into the mainstream, the same way equities, the same way cryptos have to this point. But we also know that conversation liquidity, which I'm stealing from a friend, Rishi Khanna, who uses this term all the time. But the idea of a conversation about a thing, whether it's an asset or a person or a movie, when that becomes ubiquitous and that's in everyday conversation, and you're in a coffee shop and you hear somebody talking about it, that's when it's time to kind of pass that thing. That's when it's real. I think that we're starting to see assets like this in really liquid conversation where it's nonstop, whether it's about an auction result for a watch or it's a conversation around like a sports card. All of it is part of the zeitgeist now. So for us, being ahead of that, making sure that we're in all the asset verticals that matter to our users and to future users, and making sure that our assets are the ones that are in the conversation is a huge part of what we're doing for this year. So that's everything from inside the app to our second museum space that we're opening here in New York in a month in May. It'll be on Broadway between Howard and Grand. It's like our first big footprint. We're gonna do another one probably on the West Coast. We're gonna really go to places where our users are and activate those communities to bring these assets to life and keep sort of trying to be ahead of that curve and making sure that they have the opportunity to be ahead of that curve with us.
It's incredible. And if you were to think about whether external or internal, what are some of the biggest risks that Rally faces today?
I think it's like anything else. Like the great thing about being able to build something quick and distribute it really quickly is that you get into the hands of a ton of people and they get to tell you really quickly whether or not it works or it doesn't. I think the trade-off for that is the same thing, is that if it doesn't work and you put a lot of time and effort into something, everybody's really fickle right now. And I think that the younger generations, they don't have that type of brand loyalty that I did, where when I was growing up, it was Coke or Pepsi. You know what I mean? I wasn't finding like Olipop and like 400 other startup straight to direct to consumer beverages and Sodas of America and all this. And now you go into a grocery store and everything looks the same, it feels the same, but it's a lot of different choices. And I'm going to try every single one. I think for us, it's the same thing. We have to make sure that we're always listening to our users and to our investors and to the people around us and not making sort of, random decisions that could affect our platform, because we put a lot of time and effort into everything we build. So staying ahead of it, staying on that bleeding edge of where that conversation is and where that liquid conversation is for these individual collectibles and these individual assets is a huge part of what we're trying to do right now. Like, we're a great business. We're well capitalized. We have awesome users. Our first 10,000 users are people who I know by name at this point. They're still on this platform so many years later. But at the same time, like, you do wrong by anybody and you avoid transparency and you do things where it feels like you're doing it for the benefit of the company and not for the user, you'll lose them in a hurry. And you should. Like, a business that's not paying attention to their users, to their core users and their customers who came in on day one, or the ones that are kind of in the feedback loop nonstop, when you stop paying attention to them or even give the hint that you're going rogue, they have all the right in the world to leave you. So for us, it's really about continuing to make sure that as the business grows and the company and the headcount grow, that we always maintain those conversations. And that's something that I'm like laser focused on with everybody here, with myself, with the people around me, that their needs come first, ours come second.
Yeah. If everything goes well, what's the long-term vision of the company?
I would love to take Rally public on Rally and give it to our investors to start. I think that's like, for me, in terms of like exit lane, that makes a lot of sense. But also, again, like, somebody's going to win this space and somebody's going to win the attention battle of equities. Has the Robinhoods of the world and the Publics and the Fidelities and the Schwabs and the private wealth managers. I think crypto has the Coinbases and the Geminis, and it has the OpenSeas and the LooksRares and all the individual platforms that are about distributing crypto, distributing NFTs. That's going to happen for alternative assets. It's going to happen for collectibles. There's some great auction houses, some that we work with on a regular basis. There's a lot of sort of fractionalization starting to pop up in a lot of different places. For us, it's about getting to that level that we're in the conversation, that it becomes a verb, that it becomes something that people immediately go towards. So right now, if somebody asked me that had never seen crypto before, didn't know what Bitcoin was, what ETH was, maybe heard like Elon talking about Dogecoin or something, and they're asking, where do I go to get that? What do I do? How do I buy crypto? I'm not going to explain the nuts and bolts of it. I'm going to say download Coinbase. I think where we want to get to and where I envision this going is that if you have all your crypto on Coinbase, you have all your equities on Robinhood, I want you to have all your alternatives on Rally. And I think that we're slowly getting to a point that people realize now that alternative assets and collectibles are a real investment type, and there's something that should be in a portfolio, not investment advice, by the way. But I think they're still not sure what the easiest way to get those are or where they're the most liquid. We're that right now, but I want to get to a point that it's almost non-negotiable. That if you ask somebody, where do I go to get X, and whether it's a baseball card, an NFT, a comic book, a classic car, a dinosaur, the answer is just download Rally. I think when we get to that point, I'll know that we've kind of made it a little bit where we're not right now. Yeah.
I always like this next section. I call my founder FAQ. So I'm going to hit you with some rapid fire questions and we'll see where we get.
Let's do it.
First question I like to always open it up with is, what's particularly hard about your job?
That 80% of it is being a psychiatrist, and that's really tough sometimes.
But something that you spend a lot of time on that you would like to spend less, and something that you spend a little time on that you'd like to allocate more to?
Social media, and it's the answer for both. So I think that I'm a little bit of a control freak with design and with the aesthetic of our business and a lot of what we do. And I'm aging out a little bit. I'm not gonna lie. There's a a group of young kids who really get this at a point that I gotta be able to hand the reins off. So that's one of the same. When it's like TikTok and a few other platforms, I give it all to like our team, like Will and Lisa, who run our content, all these people who are sort of knocking things out on a day to day. They know it better than me. And then for me personally, like, I get wrapped up myself, like from 11 o'clock at night until 1 a.m. of just trying to catch up on everything that happened during the day, and inevitably wind up in like a never ending social loop. If I could break those things away and delegate that more, take it out of my personal life before bed, that would be a win.
Yeah. And what would take it there? I'm just curious.
I don't know, man. Like, Instagram being down for like a week where I could detox from it. I don't know, man. I don't know. Honestly, like it's, I think I think we're at a point now where people are starting to rebel against digital. I think the future platforms that come out, there'll be a couple social platforms that I think there's still some white space where there's a couple of sort of these ephemeral responses that we have to certain things that will be wrapped up in a social platform. But I'm getting more to a point where I feel like tangible goods, actual physical things in analog is becoming way more of a selling point for somebody who's starting a new business. I really feel like for the next 2 or 3 years, brand new, giant, flashy, shiny apps aren't going to exist or aren't going to be like as easily fundable as they were in the past. But one-off narrow funnels with individual product offerings are going to be really interesting. And what that becomes, I think, relies less on social and more on word of mouth than a physical thing. And I think we're going to start seeing more of that happen, which I think will lead to a little less of the crazy, frantic, every 3 seconds social engagement, or like the TikTok videos where it's a random out of context podcast clip and like Grand Theft Auto playing on the bottom, like frantic all nonstop. I think we're getting to a point that we're getting away from that. And I hope that's the case at some point soon. That might be the old man version of me saying that, but it'll help me not pay as much attention to social media too.
Yeah. And to add on that, I think people are focusing more on community and because of, actually follows into my next question, you the brand loyalty and the changes there, people are really focusing not only about what the brand offers, but how the brand gets to offering that, the operational components of it. Yeah. How do they treat their employee? How are they thinking about ESG, right? That's so big right now, is sustainability. How have you seen, I know you mentioned earlier, brand loyalty is different. I wouldn't say it's gone. I would say it's evolved to really care about the details and the mission and all the other things that we thought were not as important are becoming more important, but in how it pertains to physical objects, how has brand loyalty changed in your eyes, in what you've seen?
I think what we've seen and happened during the NFT run too is that you have to dox everything, and aggressive transparency is what we kind of say here. It's not about falling on the sword later. It's not about even getting ahead of like a bad narrative. It's that your business relies on ultra transparency because they don't just care about the product you're selling. No one's going to buy a faceless product anymore. And also if something shows up on Instagram or on TikTok and it's BS, it's nonsense, you're going to see a flood of comments that call it out immediately too. And if you're not responding to those and you don't have a good answer, you're already done. So I think that we try to do that internally. We don't always do the best job of it because there's so many moving parts with the business or with the company, but aggressive transparency is the only way forward in my mind. And that's something that you could start at any point, even if like you've been building something behind closed doors for a year. Once it comes out, being really clear about what the struggles that took to get there, around the things that didn't work along the way, A/B testing more in public, building in public, all of that is a non-starter at this point. If you're not doing it, you're not going to have a successful business. So we try and do that here as much as possible.
Yeah. One thing that you mentioned earlier that drummed up some curiosity is you work with some auction houses, and I'm curious on how you are able to communicate or convince them the value of kind of relinquishing the overall control of that asset and broadening the accessibility to a wider audience. And what are the monetary benefits that come with that in the long term? Because I could see that their business outcomes are you have said asset, one, to auction it off for X amount above your operating costs, create some kind of margin where you feel that you've earned or you've really kind of either returned your investment or increased its value. How do you kind of, with the traditional means, help them know that relinquishing that ownership to just them, broadening out broadcasting its accessibility? What is that? How do you communicate that long-term success and what that means for that product or service or even that company and the assets that they hold? Or how I think the best auction houses, and we work with somebody like Golden Auctions and Heritage and the team at Sotheby's, and they've been doing it for so long, and they have their loyalists. They have the people that there's only so many people who are going to spend $10 million or $5 million in a year on collectibles. Those people are not going to buy fractional. They're not going to be on our platform. And the same way, I think a lot of our platform, if they're spending $200 or $300 on an investment, and we have no minimum, so you can come in and spend $20 and own that share forever if you want. And that's fine. Like we encourage that. That's why we started the platform, to give people access to these incredible assets that are museum quality, millions of dollars, but do it at a price point that's comfortable to them. But with these auction houses, I think a lot of them do something very similar where it's a 20% take, give or take, on a premium that's get paid afterwards. If you're giving an asset to an auction house, a lot of times you're signing a non-compete where even if it doesn't sell, you can't bring it to another auction house for a year. There's all these elements that they work for that core that they go after, which is big money,
someone who's like very much based on relationship. I don't think that's going anywhere. I think there's going to be a big group of the population that wants to hold a thing, doesn't want anyone else to have it, no matter what comes with it, the price they have to pay, the premium. They're okay with that. I think that Sotheby's does a really good job of telling an awesome story, and Golden Auctions does a really good job of getting the best possible sports assets and making sure that those get in front of the right people. That's going to always exist. But I think even those businesses understand that a business like us, like Rally, has to exist at this point, because the next generation of collector, the people that they're going to have to replace at a certain point, are going to come from the people that get an education on a place like Rally, start making those investments, have some hits, have some misses, but develop a thesis around it and become lifers for collectibles. I think that they realize that those price points, $1,000 and under, are just as important for them right now as the $1 million and up. And I think any auction house that's worth their weight is not thinking about things in terms of 2 or 3 years anymore. They're thinking about 10, 15, 20 years. And I think that the next generation of that 1% of people who wind up at an auction house spending a lot of money or in a bidding war, they're going to come from platforms like this. They're not going to be like come out of thin air anymore. And the ability to sort of connect with an audience requires an auction house or some of the legacy platforms to be in the conversation. I think we've seen way more of that over the last 2 or 3 years, especially through that COVID spike, than we saw in the 20 years that came before it.
Yeah. 2 questions. What's one of your favorite things that you had in your collection? And what's one thing that you're surprised on the value that it ended up having in your platform?
Yeah. I mean, there's a few, that's a good question. There's a few. So for me personally, looking at all the stuff that's on Rally right now, when we started getting dinosaur fossils, that was an aha moment for me. And I think that it was one where when we have like an acquisition checklist and a very specific underwriting standard and the way we source asset that has to like meet a very specific criteria. But there's also this kind of intuition piece that goes with it, which is when I look at something, I'm like, oh man, that's got to be worth $1 million. And then when you find out it's only worth like 200,000, you're like, oh my God, I had no idea. How is that not worth $1 million? And I think looking at dinosaurs, having learned about them in 2nd and 3rd and 4th grade, and then being like, oh, that's crazy. Those belong in museums. And then you get sort of into the conversation about getting one, and you're like, damn, the breadth of information available on different types of dinosaurs and different eras and the bone mass of certain ones versus other ones, and why this Triceratops is worth more than this T-Rex skull, even though the T-Rex is the most important dinosaur. Like you start getting to the nitty gritty of it. And then you start thinking like it's a whole story within a story. So those assets, which are in the hundreds of thousands of dollars range, but should be, again, not investment advice. When you see a $31 million T-Rex sell at auction, you start wondering why the other ones aren't also 30 million. I think it has that cachet of big auction results, a ton of nostalgia, and something that everybody looks at and says, oh my God, I'm allowed to own that now. And that's part of why we built this platform. So that's always, the dinosaurs are like the most interesting thing to me. In terms of the ones that where value went crazy and was something I didn't expect, I think that we have the world record for the most expensive video game ever sold. And that's one that might not be broken for a little while. So we, in August of I think it was 2 years ago, we got access to Super Mario Brothers video game, still sealed. It was the highest possible grade at 9.8, which means it was basically pristine. And it was $140,000. We did the IPO for $150,000 actually. After a year, that space got really hot. Video games became a real collectible. I think we're still starting to see like a lot of volatility in the space as it kind of finds its footing and becomes a collectible that lives next to comic books and to sports cards and trading cards. But we wound up getting a buyout offer for $2 million for that asset that sold off the platform. So 1,200% return in a year, basically. And it got covered in the New York Times and on ESPN. It was everywhere. And that was this aha moment where it was like all of our thousands of investors got to that early. People that knew video games, that had a bunch of nostalgia from the 80s and 90s, and people that just saw what was happening in the sports card and comic book space and said, this is going to translate to video games. And they were all right. And as much as I really believe in the space, I'm a huge video game collector. And I have so many sealed video games in my personal collection right now, none that are worth $2 million, obviously. But to see that like everybody that got in early was right, and to see this massive return that was just exploded all over social media was very much an aha moment. And that we at Rally can source great assets, find an audience that really cares about it, and get it on the ground floor, and then show big returns like that. And that's really that was a full circle moment for this platform. I think a small microcosm of everything we're trying to build in every individual asset category.
That's beautiful. And it's amazing to see that full circle come around and what that really means to a lot of different things that people say or have a predicted value or a thesis around, and seeing that come to fruition. And there's some people that are right, some people are wrong, but the the ecosystem, it's awesome to see it just translated to a completely different space, and the acceptability becomes so widely available now. Really kind of changes a lot of the paradigms of what we thought previously. I always like to ask this question. I love how founders extract knowledge from anything that they ingest. So whether it was early in your career or now, what books or people have influenced you the most?
I got a lot around me. I've been really lucky in that my dad, I think, has always been a huge inspiration. He's somebody that he's changed his career 6, 7 times since over the course of my life. And he's always been able to sort of take the same ambition and turn it into something successful. I think watching that from day one, starting with like a small family-owned restaurant that we had and then turning into 3 or 4 other careers, has been really interesting to watch. And it's always been something I look at and say, like, it's still possible to do whatever I want to do, no matter what age I'm at and no matter what industry it is. And then I've got lucky that I've had some really good CEOs along the way too, who took an interest in me when I was super young, when I was 21 and 23 and 26 years old, like pre-30, where you have these people who are really successful. They've had exits. They're building a business. They have 100 employees, but they find the time to have the conversation with me about what I want from my future, what I think the direction the business should go in. I get frantic sometimes and I get really overwhelmed sometimes. And like my moods go like this. Everybody here will tell you that. But I think that when things are not going well, I got to get better at refocusing and not pushing the stress down. I think I've been around a lot of great CEOs, 2 or 3, Greg Marsh, Akimi before this business, John Lima, who was a CEO at Scroll Motion, which was like 3 companies ago that I was at, that always made sure to find time to get my input and also never push stress down. Like they would take pressure, and good CEOs do this. They take pressure, they take stress, they ingest it and they turn it into something positive. They don't push it down on the people below them or the people that are adjacent to them to figure out. I'm still trying to get better at that, but that's a skill that I think the best CEOs, the best leaders have, is that they don't take stress and push it down funnel. They take it and it stops at them. I think that I've been around a lot of really good CEOs to do that well.
Wow. Yeah. And it is impressive. And because a lot of the sentiment previously on the podcast, I still think is valuable, if they try to keep a medium kind of emotional state. Don't go too high, don't go too low, but transmuting some type of information into something different. I mean, I haven't heard about that as much on the podcast, but that's a pretty interesting one. And it's maybe said a different way, but I like the ingestion and the transformation of that energy into something else. It's like a little bit more active than passive. So that was
for sure.
I know we're at the end of the show, Rob, and I'm sure we could talk for much more episodes long, but last little bit, I would like to make sure we didn't leave anything on the table. Is there a question I didn't ask you that I shouldn't have, or that you would have liked to answer? Obviously, this comes before we get your plugs on everywhere we can find you, but anything left on the table?
Nah, everything's there, man. It's just next time you're in New York, come by. We'll walk you around the museum. It's opening in a month, so we'll give you a quick preview. But that's it. You covered everything, man. It was a really good conversation.
I love that, Rob. Well, it's such a pleasure learning about your early career and also what you're doing with Rally, what it really means for people, honestly, who want to invest, but maybe they don't have an attachment with the assets that are out there. These are alternative means that you can really gain not only inspiration, traction, assets, and all those different things that wasn't available regularly. It's amazing to see that it is available on Rally and see where things are going. Last little bit, where can we find you? Give us your plug, whether your LinkedIn's, your Twitter's, your websites.
Yeah. So go to everything on Instagram for Rally is Rally, RALLY. We're on Rally RD on Twitter. You can find me, Rob Petrozzo, across every platform. And then everybody has my phone number in my DM or something. I have good ideas, like drop them my way. I'll make sure you get credit for them too. I always answer, so feel free.
Amazing, Rob. Such a pleasure having you on the show. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and thank you so much for being on Behind Company Lines today.
Nah, Julian, thank you, brother. I appreciate it.
Appreciate it.